It feels right to start with the situation in Ukraine. As the Russian forces withdraw from those areas around Kyiv, we are witnessing what they've left behind. Civilians found next to bicycles, next to their shopping bags. We can't show the images of many of the atrocities, but I think it's right to kind of pause and reflect on, the human face of this, the cost of what people are going through. This is Sophia, she's 13. She has shrapnel now in her skull. This is just one of the images that we can bring to people. What should the UK's response to this be?
It's barbaric. I understand why you can't show the images. I think members of Parliament, people in responsibility, have to view those to see the scale of what we're talking about. I think after what the world saw in Syria, where the advent of modern technology meant we could see images directly from atrocities that were taking place, meant we knew these kind of images were possible, yet it's still the threshold from some of the things I saw last night was a new level of barbarity. I think what this country has done, what NATO have done in terms of supplying lethal aid to the Ukrainians is obviously the right thing to have done, and I think that needs to continue and step up as we get to a new phase of this conflict where clearly the Ukrainians are having some success pushing entrenched Russian positions back. But what I wanted from the Chancellor in the spring statement was almost a sort of a wartime statement in terms of energy, how we were going to make sure we weren't still, as we are right now, as the Western community, buying substantial amounts of fossil fuels from Russia, that we could use emergency measures to lower our gas demand, whether that's energy efficiency or more electrification or pushing that. And I didn't feel that. And I think we've got to understand this is not a short-term position. It's going to go on. It's going to continue. We have to prepare for that.
We'll talk about the details of the energy strategy later, but just to focus purely on Ukraine and Russia. And you're right to say that we're still spending an awful lot of money on oil and gas, and Europe in particular. Since the start of the war, I think the EU has spent 18 billion euros on Russian oil and gas. I mean, are any sanctions going to have an impact at all when Russia is still effectively being bankrolled by Europe?
Well, they will have an effect, and they are having an effect, because the level of sanctions are very significant, certainly in terms of how the Russian...
But the Russian ruble has effectively recovered
but you're right to say it. There's two things going on here. We've tried to isolate, as the world community, Russia from the global economy, whilst at the same time having that dependency. Now, in terms of oil, the danger is you just go from one autocratic, authoritarian regime to another, so that's not a long-term solution. Russian gas, I think there's a bit of complacency in the UK because Russian gas in the main goes to Central Europe, but of course, because of that, countries like Norway then supply the UK. So we've got to understand that what is required is not anything which increases our dependency long-term on fossil fuels, but gets us off that dependency. And that is why there's got to be this further sprint on renewables. There are things, we've got a good story in this country on offshore wind, but on things like onshore wind, a bad story where we've had effectively a ban in place. So there are other things that can be done, but it can't be going from one country to another, deciding just who's the most unpalatable this month, this year. It's got to be that longer-term conversion to electrification, to further renewables, to further nuclear, because that's the only way forward.
We'll talk about that a little bit more later. The government's also promised a safe haven for Ukrainian refugees in the UK. Are they delivering on that?
Well, I think the rhetoric after the initial period has been where it needs to be. I think the delivery of that is a further question. I think there's been a huge response from the British people around this in terms of people signing up for the Homes for Ukrainians scheme. The worry is how is that feeding through on the ground, the bureaucracy that's required behind that, making sure people are coming through. I don't think, because we've seen in the past few years some horrible situations that have led to significant humanitarian flows, I almost think we're struggling to understand the sheer scale of this. I mean, the figures of people in Poland and Romania alone. These are levels of movements of people in Europe that we just haven't seen for decades. And I think when you see what other countries are coping with and doing, it's hard to say that as of yet we have met the scale of that challenge. So I hope the government recognises that and is willing to do more.
The other thing we can, of course, do is to provide more weaponry. You said earlier that you think that should be stepped up. What exactly do you mean by stepped up?
Well, the first phase of this conflict has seen a tremendous response from the Ukrainian armed forces using essentially Western-trained tactics, light units with anti-tank weaponry, which has stopped the advance of Russian units. But obviously this is now a different phase as they retreat, and we're obviously seeing, unfortunately, atrocities occur as those forces leave. So that might require a different level of
Even
equipment.
if Russia would see that as an escalation?
Well, I think Russia's position in terms of what they have already done and what they are doing, it would be a little bit rich of them to claim escalation on the part or over the civilized countries. I think we've got to listen very carefully to what the Ukrainians are telling us about the equipment they need. There's a different balance there, maybe in terms of air defence units and heavier artillery compared to the lighter units that have had such brilliant success and a brilliant performance by the Ukrainians so far. But we've got to listen to that and respond to that, because frankly, I think the sanctions have had a significant effect on Russia's ability to resupply and keep the occupation forces in place. But what we are seeing in terms of them leaving, this is not, I'm afraid to say, it's not the end of the conflict. It's not a peaceful position we're returning to. We've got to acknowledge that.
Okay. Well, let's talk now about the energy strategy, shall we? You mentioned it a bit earlier in the interview. Next week, we're expecting the Prime Minister to unveil it. It feels as if the briefing today is all about nuclear, with the Business Secretary saying up to 7 new nuclear plants. But of course, that's not going to help families with their bills now, is it? That's going to take 13 to 17 years for that energy to come into the stream. Does Labour support the broad direction of where the government's moving?
Well, we do support more nuclear in the system alongside that further development of renewables. I think the danger, as you say, is that whilst that's for the long term, and frankly the individual commissioning decisions on nuclear reactors all depend on the price you can achieve, and that relates very much to the financing of them. At the right price, to the right thing to do, they can be very expensive if you haven't been able to get the right deal and the right private sector partners to do that. I think none of that should be used as a smokescreen to get away from the real issue, which is right now the cost of living is absolutely extreme. Energy bills are a huge part of that. The government hasn't done enough. There's no way they can say they've done enough. The scheme they put forward, I think, where the Chancellor's offering to lend us our own money and pay it back over 5 years, is completely unrealistic and doesn't meet the scale of the challenge. What we want to do, of course, is that windfall taxes, offer people real support, £600 for a third of households off their energy bills. That's the scale of what is required. And whatever the long-term energy strategy the government unveil, it can't get away from the fact that they've got to take some action now to help people.
I mean, something that could have an impact in the short term is looking at the supply of oil and gas as well, isn't it? Was it the right decision by the North Sea Transition Agency to look at this 2-year extension of the Cambo oil fields licence?
Well, domestic gas and oil from the North Sea is about half our domestic supply at the minute. And that should continue, and no one questions that strategy. The longer-term extraction picture for all fossil fuels around the world has to be, of course, governed by...
Well, you say that, but at the same time, Labour has previously opposed the development of the Cambo oil field, and you're talking about a windfall tax in the North Sea as well. If you were looking at this, you might think that actually Labour isn't that happy about the idea of using oil and gas.
It's got to be governed by...
in the short term.
It's got to be governed by the Committee on Climate Change. There's no point as a country having noble objectives.
Does it? Is that what you think? So you think the priority should be achieving net zero opposed to bringing bills down?
There is no point this country having an ambitious climate strategy if we're not going to stick to it. And of course...
Even if people face huge difficulties with paying their bills, even if people are having to turn off their heating.
Well, let's be clear, more domestic supply is about the security of that supply. It's not about the price. The price is set by the global market price for that. So even if we, for instance, wanted to go down the route of extracting a fundamentally larger amount of oil and gas from the UK, that wouldn't affect the price. The only way to affect the price is to focus on energy efficiency, so people are using less, is to switch to domestic, cheaper electrification of heating. So it's very important people understand that point. There is one thing that's different about the situation now because of what Russia has done is there's an argument about substitution of supplies that would have perhaps come from Russia coming from other parts of the world. So when I say the Committee on Climate Change has to look at that picture in the round, that is exactly what they will do. But anyone who thinks bills or supply in the long term can be solved by more dependence on fossil fuels, that is a mistake. You've got to look at the alternative, which is renewables and nuclear. I've
got 2 very short questions to squeeze in before we have to let you go. Firstly, David Warburton has had the Conservative whip withdrawn after allegations made in the Sunday Times. Now, without going into the details of the case, he says he's heard nothing from the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. Do you have concerns about the culture in Westminster?
Well, I've read the story, and that's all I know about this particular thing. I think the vast majority of members of Parliament work very hard for their constituents, whatever their party affiliation. Certainly as a front bencher for most of my time in Parliament, I've been, in opposition. You've got to do quite a lot of work to make sure you're matching the capacity the government has in the civil service. I think there are, in any sector I've worked in, whether that's the legal sector or politics, I think there are people who sometimes aren't balancing the responsibilities and the burdens on them in the right way, and they sometimes, that gets them into trouble and behaviour they shouldn't do. But I don't think politics is any different, in my experience, to other high-pressured sectors in relation to how people behave.
OK, and finally, just summarise, will you, the tax policy that you want to try and announce today?
Well, the cost of living is extreme, the government isn't doing enough, and people would be better off under Labour. So that's because we wouldn't have proceeded with the national insurance rise. It's because we would have done that windfall tax to help people with their energy bills. It's because on business rates, which is a huge expense for business, we would have frozen the valuations, we would have increased the threshold at which businesses pay business rates. So the average pub or hairdresser, on top of what the government have done, would be around £2,000 to £3,000 better off. So we would do real help for people now, and that's what would make a difference. OK, that's the Labour pitch then. We'll get the government pitch in just a few moments' time, but thank you for being on the programme today. Thank you.